Good afternoon and welcome to week 7, day 2. We are almost at mid-semester. I can't believe it. I'm really glad to have you all here today. Going to go ahead and pull up our agenda for the day. First of all, I would be remiss were I not to wish you a happy National Polar Bear Day. So happy National Polar Bear Day. I don't know if there's an acronym for that, but there probably should be. And I tried to find a cutie to put up here for you. So there you go. But luckily we're not in that weather anymore, right? That's good. All right, and also in other news on this day in the history of psychology, this I thought you would find interesting. Today is not February 28th though, is it? It's the 27th. In other news, tomorrow in the history of psychology, Francis Galton was measured at his own anthropometric laboratory. Some sample measurements included a right-hand squeeze strength of 80 pounds. Is that impressive? I don't know. It must mean he's intelligent, right? Head breadth of 6.15 inches. And a 4.4-inch length of the middle finger of his left hand. So lest you not be in the know about that, now you know. The publication Frustration and Aggression came out by some pioneers in the field. Conditioning and Learning was published in 1940, and tomorrow in 1955, psychology was the subject of a Time magazine cover. It featured the works of Kaler and Breland in an article titled IQ Zoo. So there we have our polar bear tie-in for you. The Brelands were both students of B.F. Skinner, right? And B.F. Skinner, if you think back to Introduction to Psychology or Developmental Psychology, what type of psychology was he a pioneer within? So there's a subset of psychology.
The Skinner box.
Yes.
Was it learning or training?
Yes, so he talked a lot about conditioning, learning, but the broader concept was behaviorism. So maybe a way you can remember that in the future is to think B.F. Skinner behaviorism. So this was the idea that we can learn what people are thinking through observing them, and that we can shape their behavior through rewards and punishments, okay? All right, and a lot of the behaviorism research was done on animals, so just needed to make sure that you were understanding that part. So Animal Behavior Enterprises was a for-profit animal training business. The IQ Zoo used operant methods, so operant conditioning, to train animals for a wide variety of entertainment, advertising, and military applications. That's interesting. The title, The Misbehavior of Organisms, reflected on the roles of innate and learned components of behavior. So in your spare time, you can check out The Misbehavior of Organisms, all right? That is in the link that I posted this morning. Pardon me. I want now to circle back to Wilhelm Wundt. Tell me what you remember about good old Wilhelm or Wilhelm.
Dad was a professor and a preacher.
Okay.
There were one in the book, but he's not at the point where he was not exactly the best student. It said that he was focused on pretty much anything but the ministry.
Yes, exactly. What can I do that doesn't involve ministry? And I'll pursue all of those things. Yes, good. Others?
He was the first to study the process of human brain.
Okay, good.
Thought meter.
The thought meter, very good. So the chronometer, right? That was pioneering and a legacy. Others?
He was the first person to open a lab to study the brain scientifically.
Yeah, and so the study of the brain was now something that was being pursued methodologically. We were using the experimental method, and that was a big breakthrough. I feel like we might need to revisit the PowerPoint just to perhaps fill in some blanks and refresh our minds before we jump into talking about Charles Darwin and evolutionary psychology. Okay. Well, we at the beginning of class, I had you think about an experiment and things that come to mind. I believe we talked about the setup of an experiment, how you're going to test your dependent variable, whatever that is. You're going to establish some sort of treatment protocol, and then you're going to do what at the end with your dependent variable?
Measure the difference.
Yeah, so you're going to retest it. So you administer something, I believe we were talking about the subjective well-being scale. We were going to place people in different treatment groups for yoga, right? 8 weeks, 2 days a week, is that correct? I think that was our setup. And one group was going to get face-to-face yoga. A group was going to get it online, like via Zoom, with the same instructor, and another group was the what? Control group, right. And we're not saying abstain from yoga, because then that would be the no yoga group, but rather just go about your day doing yoga or not doing yoga. And then after that time period, we're going to administer the same test again to see if there's a significant difference between those who did yoga versus going about their own day, and if online yoga or face-to-face yoga, if one is significantly better than the other. And remember, when we're talking about significance in psychology, in statistics, we're talking about the difference in this case is not due to chance, all right? So he gave us a clean design for conducting research in an experimental, very methodological manner, all right? And yeah, I think that's all I want to mention on that. Was already mentioned, his father was a pastor, an evangelical pastor. He was born in Germany. Had good tutelage. He had a grandfather who'd been a professor and uncles who were physicians and professors of physiology. Very ill as a child, right? And what do you remember of him growing up? What kind of child would he have struck you to be?
ADHD kid, like always dreaming, there was.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So he lived in a world of daydreams, and I think part of that was probably to escape from the bullying and things that he endured as a child. He was a sick child, and quite honestly, he sounded like a depressed child, right? So, yeah, definitely now if we looked at him through the lens of present day therapy, we might see some of that ADHD as something that was going on in his life. He eventually, though, was able to get through high school and enrolled in medical school after he graduated. As with some others we've mentioned, namely Helmholtz, although he had the training in medicine, he was much more interested in pursuing research, right? And so just to go back, he was a researcher with Robert Bunsen, who was the inventor of the Bunsen burner, and learned a great deal from him that shaped his interest, desires, and the way he went about conducting his own research. We talked about his first scientific publication, which was a little bit different, studying the impact of salt deprivation on the composition of his own urine. So tracking the deprivation over a period of time and looking at how his urine changed or did not change as a result of that deprivation. He also studied the impact of the vagus nerve on respiration. And maybe you had an opportunity on your own to look at this link that was posted that tells a little bit about the vagus nerve, but that is actually the longest nerve in our body. It's known as the wandering nerve. He practiced medicine for a brief time, but like I said, he enjoyed research much more. He was Helmholtz's assistant for 6 years. But he saw himself predestined to go off and do his own thing. He gathered a lot of skills and knowledge from working with Helmholtz, but he still very much kept to himself outside of the laboratory. He never really talks about the book, never really formed much in the way of emotional bonds with Helmholtz or with any of the other assistants of Helmholtz. During this time, he also wrote about vision and perception of space. And I don't know about you, but some of these people make you think that they had more than 24 hours in a day, right, to be doing all of this, the work of Helmholtz, and conducting his own research. I mean, it's pretty awe-inspiring. Any questions on that? Okay. The thought meter experiment that was mentioned, this is exceptionally important. He was testing the common assumption that when two different stimuli strike our senses, we become consciously aware of them at the same time. And indeed, that is not the case, and there is a little bit of a time lapse with that, right? And so he developed this mental chronometer for measuring that, and it consisted of a pendulum. You remember there's an illustration, I think, in our textbook where you see a grandfather clock, you see a pendulum moving back and forth. These sorts of experiments led to the establishment of experimental psychology. And everyone, so research encompasses many different types of approaches. The experimental method is but one approach within research, okay? But it is the only approach, you'll need to know this just for yourself, but also for the test, that can test cause and effect, because it's able to control for things, all right? Like others that we've heard of, Wundt felt psychology needed to stay under the umbrella of philosophy. He believed that psychological processes were extremely important, but were hard to measure using the experimental method, so that he found physiological processes much easier to capture that way, right? Sensation, etc. Okay. Well, Wundt is hard at work. He's formulating 2 different branches of psychology, began actively pursuing them, but he was struggling during this time to make a living. When he resigned as Helmholtz's assistant, he took an unpaid position as an assistant professor, and his sole compensation came from these special courses he would teach to these paying students. So he was literally scraping, not literally, figuratively scraping by to make a living. He was hard at work, however, with a publication entitled Principles of Physiological Psychology, and that changed his fortune a great deal. When this came onto the landscape, it was a seminal work in this field. First genuine psychology textbook. Of course, this textbook covered vast terrain, but also within it was the observation that physiology investigates living organisms by our external senses, while psychology examines things from within and tries to explain processes that emerge from this internal perception. So again, sensation and perception. Okay, he was in demand. Congratulations to him. In 1874, he won a full professorship in philosophy at the University of Zurich. And this was despite the fact that he had only taken one philosophy course in his entire education. Sort of interesting, right? All right. Any questions on Wilhelm Wundt? The magnitude of his impact, I can't really underscore that enough. So definitely spend time in the book unpacking his work. What I want to do now, and I'm going to move the board for this, is want to talk a little bit about evolutionary psychology and Charles Darwin. By raising your hand by a show of hands, how many of you have heard of Charles Darwin? Okay, good. What I'm going to be asking for you to do is tell me, as I roll this out here, our old school item here, what you know, what you remember about him. And that is not a good marker. Okay. Charles Darwin. Or over here.
His theory of evolution by natural selection.
Okay, so two things, theory of evolution. Can you tell us more about natural selection?
It's like species will like change, adapt, / die off according to the environment around them.
Mm-hmm. One more second. Let me try another marker. So they'll adapt or die off in response to environmental stressors, and those who live and are able to adapt have some genetic material that appears to be, some might see as quote unquote superior, right? And that it's that advantage that allows them to adapt and advance. Okay, good. And we're going to talk more about that. Others? Is that it?
Yeah, he was on the Voyage of the Beagle.
The beagle, yes. We'll talk a lot about the beagle. I don't know how many of you know about the cartoon Peanuts and Snoopy, but he voyaged on something called a beagle. I mean, if you know what a beagle looks like, it just seems like a misnomer for the kind of ship that he should be on when he's making these great discoveries. So yes, he voyaged on the beagle for many years. Okay, anything else you'd like to add?
You go to like the Galapagos Islands and study like the tortoise and some bird or something.
Yeah, some bird, actually, finches. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, Galapagos Island.
Yeah.
I will bludgeon this. Galapagos Island. And what he was looking at is he was looking within the island at the differences in the beaks of the finches. So based on geographic location, the beak shapes would change to adapt to the vegetation, the environment of that area, and that was pretty amazing research. Good. I feel like we've not exhausted ourselves on Darwin yet, but I could be reading the room really wrong.
When he was on the beagle, the tortoises,
Yes?
they actually kept those on board for food.
All
Not
right.
really, yeah, it's just a,
I don't know if I want to put that down.
It's just an interesting little tidbit.
because they can go for months without eating or drinking
Uh-huh.
and still stay alive, so they.
They're probably trying to run around with their heads really stuck in, right? Don't eat me. Oh my gosh. Okay. All right. Well. All right. Well, thank you for that introduction. So as you know, my voice is still recovering from whatever cold I've had, and I still have remnants of if we want to move from tortoises to frogs, remnants of Helmholtz frog in my throat, kind of thing. So without further ado, we are going to watch most of this movie today. all right? I need you to take very detailed notes, all right? This is gonna be, probably 25% of the exam is gonna be over this video and over what we cover on Darwin, because he is such an essential, figure within psychology, within really, when you start to unpack it, a lot of different disciplines. And I particularly enjoy this, and so a little bit of that is just bias on my own part, and I can admit that. All right. Oh no. Okay. We will plan to stop. I want us to be able to have a nice discussion, so we'll watch this for about the next 40 minutes or so, all right? Please pay close attention. Make sure I get the volume
The man
right.
known to history as Charles Darwin.
Is
was
that
born
loud
the
enough
12th
or
of
too
February,
loud?
1809.
Would
in
you like
Shrewsbury, the county town of
subtitles?
Shropshire in the west of England. His father was Robert Waring Darwin, a physician who was remembered in part for his towering stature and imposing frame.
How's that?
At over 6 feet in height
Okay.
and weighing 24 stone. Darwin later recalled that his father was the largest man he had ever seen, and noted the conversations that he would have with his father, who assumed that his son would follow him into the medical profession. Charles Darwin's mother was Susanna Darwin, née Wedgwood, who died suddenly when Charles was aged 8, of either a severe ulcer or stomach cancer. He later recalled that he could remember hardly anything about her except her deathbed, her black velvet gown, and her curiously constructed work table. Charles's grandfather on his father's side was Erasmus Darwin, a noted scientist who had mooted a theory of evolution in his poem The Loves of the Plants, written in 1789, in which he referenced vestigial organs in plants, flies, and humans, noting, for instance, the fact that human males had nipples, and flies unused fourth wings. He also created designs for a rocket engine which would be powered by hydrogen and oxygen, a canal bridge which would lift barges, and a copying machine, many of which were not realized in practice until long after his death. Erasmus Darwin was a notable writer and an accomplished man of science who turned down an offer from George III to become his royal physician, and instead directed his attention to the writing of poetry and the management of a new club, the Lunar Society of Birmingham, which was devoted to philosophical discussion between industrialists, scientists, and poets, to name a few. The relationship between Erasmus and his son Robert was strained, leading Charles to have little contact with his grandfather's theories and writings. These were not treasured by Robert, who instead attempted to encourage the young Charles to become a man of medicine. The Darwin family also included several other children, including one younger and 3 older sisters, as well as a single brother, Erasmus, who was 5 years older than Charles. His sister, Caroline, provided Charles with his first education, despite being only 9 years older than him. Having been educated for a time by Caroline, Charles later became a student of the Reverend G. Case, a Unitarian minister who noted that Charles had a passion for collecting various ephemera from the natural world, including seashells, minerals, and stones. When aged 9, Charles was enrolled at Dr. Butler's school in Shrewsbury, where he boarded, despite only living a mile away. He recalled later that he would often run home before the school was closed for the night in order to see his family, which he argued was absolutely essential in maintaining his mental health and well-being. Darwin spent much of his free time reading and was deeply interested in the poetic works of Byron and the writings of Shakespeare, although he later lost interest in them. He was also fascinated by the idea of travel and enjoyed reading works which depicted adventure and foreign lands. Charles's interest in science stemmed both from his readings and from the activities of family members. His brother's interest in chemistry led him to construct a makeshift lab in their garden shed, and his uncle excitedly instructed Charles on the operation of a barometer. His fascination with fauna was augmented on family trips, such as those which the Darwins made to the Welsh coast, in which Charles noted that the insects and flowers to be found there were not always the same as in his home county. Charles performed with average success at school and entered the University of Edinburgh when he was aged 16, although it was noted by his father that a significant reason for his leaving school early was because he lacked any great progress in his studies there. Charles was emotionally healthy, from what we can gather from contemporary reports and autobiographical statements, although he recalled that he had once kicked his puppy for the sense of power that it afforded him, and that he was sometimes frustrated by the social standing of the sciences, which were often regarded as beneath a gentleman. Entrance to the University of Edinburgh was encouraged by Charles's father on the basis that this would lead to his inevitable medical career. The university was a renowned centre for medical learning and counted amongst its alumni Charles Bell, the discoverer of Bell's palsy, as well as the functions of the root of spinal nerves, William Hewson, the father of hematology, and James Lind, who discovered cures for scurvy and typhus, as well as the model for the first clinical trial. Charles entered the university with some misgivings about his own enthusiasm for the course, and was not helped by the poor teaching standards he found there, later recalling the boredom he had felt in lectures, and bemoaning the lack of hands-on experience which his teachers afforded him and his classmates. University had nonetheless given Charles some experience which he would later come to rely upon. He presented his first academic paper to the Plinian Society while studying there, and had met an academic who would later come to support his theory of evolution, one Dr. Grant. After 2 years at Edinburgh, Charles had decided that he no longer wished to study medicine, following in the footsteps of his brother who had already quit his medical course at Edinburgh, and his father decided instead that he should enter the clergy as an alternative. Charles was entered at Christ's College at the University of Cambridge when aged 19. He once again, by his own admission, wasted his student days by becoming involved with a group of fellow students who preferred the shooting field to the library, and he gained a pass mark in his final exams. The university had been invaluable to Charles as a means of introducing him to academics who would be formative in his own pursuit of science. J.S. Henslow and Adam Sedgwick both influenced Charles as a student and later in his life. Henslow was the man who would arrange Charles's journey on the Beagle and often met with him for walks and discussions about science and art. Darwin also befriended H. Thompson, later an MP, and Dr. William Whewell, who was to become the Master of Trinity College and later the Dean of Hereford. Darwin left Christ's College in 1831 and joined Sedgwick on an excursion the same year to North Wales, where he was taught the theory and method of geology and was given an opportunity to apply his newfound skills as part of an academic investigation. In August 1831, Henslow wrote to Darwin and informed him of an expedition planned aboard the Beagle, a Cherokee-class 10-gun brig sloop of the Royal Navy. Her captain, Robert Fitzroy, had written to Henslow and had stated that he would welcome a naturalist on his voyage, given that they would undertake the journey without pay. Darwin was delighted at the chance to undertake a voyage as a naturalist aboard a Royal Navy vessel, although his father was angered that he was yet again stepping further from a career as a doctor or a clergyman. Charles implored his uncle to speak to his father, and after a discussion between Josiah Wedgwood and his brother-in-law, Robert agreed to let Charles embark on the Beagle. On the 27th of December 1831, the HMS Beagle departed from Devonport. Charles, with a degree in theology and classics, was her resident naturalist. Scientifically, he was alone and had no one of comparable experience or expertise, even though he lacked an academic background in the discipline which underpinned his vocation. Charles spent his first day aboard the Beagle constructing a timetable for himself, which would allow him to become acquainted more intimately with the subjects of meteorology, mathematics, and biology, as well as other subjects such as French and the Greek New Testament, which he decided would form the basis of his reading on Sundays. He also had copies of Paradise Lost and Humboldt's personal narrative, in which the scientist and explorer Alexander von Humboldt detailed his adventures to the Americas. Darwin noted in letters home that he had a difficult relationship with the captain, Fitzroy, as did many other members of the crew. Fitzroy was a member of the aristocracy and an illegitimate descendant of Charles II, with a wicked temper which would flare erratically. Darwin also recounted an event in which he argued with Fitzroy on the subject of slavery, which the latter supported. Darwin wrote that the argument had been so fierce that he had pondered leaving the Beagle altogether. Darwin shared his lodgings aboard the Beagle with Augustus Earle, a draftsman, and became friendly with several other members of the crew, including John Stokes and Charles Musters, a first-class volunteer. Another, Sims Covington, was a cabin boy who was later to become a personal assistant to Darwin. Over the course of the voyage, Darwin's notes show a man becoming ever more convinced of the potency of natural selection, as well as his conviction that fossils were the remnants of life forms which had existed before humans had appeared, all of which he formulated during his first few weeks at sea, as he studied aboard the vessel in his cabin. He concurrently battled seasickness and wrote simply that the Bay of Biscay was hell. During the first weeks of 1832, Darwin commenced practical studies and developed a net for collecting plankton, which he studied and wrote about emphatically in his diaries, noting the vast array of colors and forms which these creatures took. On the 16th of January, the Beagle made landfall on St. Jago in the Cape Verde Islands off the coast of modern-day Mauritania. He recalled that upon setting foot on the island, he was entranced by the volcanic rocks, the song of strange birds, and the vast array of flora and fauna that he saw. During his time in the Cape Verde Islands, Darwin developed a theory that hard white rocks, which littered the islands, were formerly molten lava flows which had flown over the seabed and contained imprints from shells and coral reefs. On the 28th of February, the crew of the Beagle alighted on the shores of Bahia, now a state of Brazil, and home to the city of Salvador. He wrote that this land is a chaos of delight, and his time in Brazil was to have a great impact on him and his work. He wrote of the beauty of the wildlife and of the nature in Brazil, and argued that this was nature in its grandest form. He also stated that to a naturalist, there was a pleasant nuisance in having to stop every few yards to study a new creature or flower. Darwin also encountered much slavery in Brazil, which was the last country in the Western world to abolish the practice, which it eventually did in 1888. He was deeply disturbed by what he saw, and wrote that, "I hope the day will come when they will assert their own rights and forget to avenge their wrongs." Darwin and his companions settled at the small village of Botafogo, which was located a short distance outside of Rio de Janeiro, situated on a lagoon. He soon embarked on a 3-week ride into the countryside from his base, during which he traveled a distance of several hundred miles, in what would have been a dramatic and exhaustive introduction to his new landscape. When working from his base in Botafogo, Darwin also maintained a strict routine and collected specimens one day, to be followed by a day of preserving and analyzing his finds on the following day, a 2-day timetable which he maintained for the duration of his stay. Darwin was able to observe dramatic and exciting natural events in person when in Brazil, and noted with great interest an incident in which he had witnessed a vampire bat bite a horse, and made notes on glowworms, butterflies, and fungi. On the 5th of July 1832, the Beagle left Rio and traveled south for Montevideo, now the capital of Uruguay. Upon their arrival, the crew were informed that a revolution was taking place in the city, an event which was part of a series of conflicts which had emerged in Uruguay following the Declaration of Independence in 1828, and reflected a conflict between two political factions which had entered the vacuum which followed. The conflict into which the Beagle had strayed was a rebellion by the Montevideo garrison in support of Juan Lavalleja, the leader of the 33 Orientals, a revolutionary faction which opposed the presidency of Fructuoso Rivera, a veteran military commander who was the incumbent leader. Fitzroy made the decision not to land in Montevideo and instead proceeded to Buenos Aires, whereupon they were fired at by an Argentine naval vessel, a problem which was later rectified by the governor. After this, the Beagle returned again to Montevideo, and Fitzroy requested to land at a private mooring. After this stop, the Beagle continued south, hugging the coastline in order to observe it. It was during this stretch of the journey that Darwin was marooned for a single night. This was due to bad weather, which meant that the Beagle was unable to come and pick him up from the island, at which he had stopped in order to take samples. He would later write that he never knew such cold, although the experience allowed him to come across samples of fascinating fossils, such as that of the extinct giant armadillo and the giant sloth. The ship continued to pace back and forth between Buenos Aires and Montevideo, allowing the crew to send and receive mail, and Darwin to ship off his specimens home. Fitzroy, the captain of the Beagle, was also able to undertake a disturbing practice when he released 3 Fuegan prisoners that he had attempted to westernize from a previous voyage, sending them back to their communities with a bizarre assortment of items, such as cabbages, tea trays, cutlery, and wine glasses. This was an incident, however, which Darwin expressed his opposition to. The next few weeks were spent by Darwin undertaking riding expeditions around Buenos Aires and Patagonia, during which he reported to have felt the extremes of human comfort, writing that he often suffered from a great thirst and that the seemingly endless riding had caused him to feel incredibly tired. He was also plagued by mosquitoes and reported that the jaguars which inhabited the surrounding forests had caused great fear amongst his guides. On returning from an expedition back to Buenos Aires, Darwin found himself unable to enter the city on account of another revolution, and instead was forced to remain outside the city proper for a great period of time. He was unable to reach the Beagle until the 4th of November, after which the vessel sailed, eventually calling into the Rio de Santa Cruz in Argentina. The Beagle had been damaged over the course of her voyage and required repairs, which were undertaken at the mouth of the river. Meanwhile, Fitzroy had planned an expedition to the Cordillera de la Costa mountain range, which would require the crew to embark on a 245-mile trip upstream, a journey which was spread over 13 days, and which the captain ultimately deemed a failure. On the 12th of May, 1834, the Beagle set out on her final trip south and crossed into the Pacific Ocean on the 9th of June, eventually reaching Valparaiso in Chile at the end of July. From here, Darwin trekked the Andes and was able to observe the differences in flora and fauna which correlated with their altitude. Darwin then contracted an illness, likely to be Chagas disease, which caused him to experience fever, swollen lymph nodes, and headaches, and to which some historians attributed his later poor health, such as his lethargy and heart problems. He reported at the time in his letters home that he had experienced great periods of tiredness and that he had suffered from blackouts and confusion. From Valparaiso, Darwin made one of his most important geological expeditions and ascended 10,000 feet into the Andes in order to observe the segmentation of the Earth from the sides of the mountains which surrounded him. He commented that it was the first view I ever saw which really resembled those pretty sections which geologists make of the inside of the Earth. Darwin also advanced on one of his longest expeditions, traveling some 450 miles to the north during which he collected well over 100 geological specimens, which he labeled and recorded. By this time, he had been away from home for over 3.5 years, and his letters, despite showing his excitement at his work, reflected an ardent desire to return to England. On the 7th of September 1835, the Beagle sailed for the Galapagos Islands, which were to become synonymous with Darwin's work. As soon as the ship anchored off the islands, the focus of Darwin's work switched from geology to biology, and he noted eagerly that the flora and fauna of the islands closely reflected those of South America. Darwin's observation of tortoises and birds on the islands stemmed from his interest in the fact that locals were able to identify which island an animal came from on the basis of their appearance. Such was the localization of their variants. He realized that finches on the various islands had differences in their appearance, which correlated with the island from which they had originated. The beaks of the Galapagos finches were of particular interest to Darwin, and he noted that some were better suited to the consumption of insects and some seeds, suggesting they were adaptations to specific environments. However, his notes at the time suggest that he did not realize the implications of his observation, writing that, "When I see these islands in sight of each other and possessed of but a scanty stock of animals, tenanted by these birds, but slightly different in structure and filling the same place in nature, I must suspect that they are only varieties." The Beagle remained in the Galapagos archipelago for a further 4 weeks, from which it sailed south over the Pacific, spending Christmas Day of 1835 in New Zealand. While there, he commended the work that was being performed by missionaries in the region, and indeed, one of his first published reports from the voyage was included in an edition of the South African Christian Recorder, in which he wrote, "Missionaries thoroughly deserve the warmest support, not only of individuals, but of the British government." Such was his interest in the work of these organizations. Darwin co-signed this statement with the Beagle's captain Fitzroy. On the 12th of January 1836, the Beagle landed in Australia in what was the 5th year of her expedition. He noted in his diary that he was pleased to have a level of immunity to European diseases. Such was the suffering of native communities with illnesses such as measles. In Australia, Darwin also noted the similarities between different species of mammal and noted their development had occurred in tandem with those of other continents. He stated in his notes that he was surprised that such similarities had developed through such a varied pathway, noting that it seemed as if two creators had come by the same product through an entirely different process. The Beagle soon set sail for home and made an unexpected stop in Bahia, where the ship had landed 4.5 years before. Darwin was exhausted and craved a return to England, writing, "We have now steered, thanks to God, a direct course for England." Darwin, on the return voyage, reflected on the majesty of the untouched natural world which he had been able to encounter through his journey, and the power of nature which he had been able to discover undefaced. This he referred to as an almost religious experience, writing that it inspired a feeling that there is more to man than the mere breadth of his body. On the 2nd of October 1836, the Beagle landed at Falmouth in Cornwall, and 2 days later, Darwin had returned to his home in Shrewsbury for the first time in over 5 years. He found that his family welcomed him home with open arms, and his father, impressed with his discoveries, accepted his choice of career as a naturalist. Once he had returned home, Darwin went to Cambridge and then to London in order to arrange and edit the official Zoology of the Voyage of the Beagle, in which he wrote extensively about the journey as well as his discoveries and ideas. Humboldt, his hero, was impressed with Darwin's work and praised his writing on travels in the tropics. Over the course of the 1840s, Darwin published further works which stemmed from research which he had conducted on the Beagle, including coral reefs, volcanic islands, and geological observations on South America, and was able to encounter various great scientists such as Sir Charles Lyell and Sir Joseph Hooker. Lyell was a prominent scientist and proponent of the theory of uniformitarianism, the idea that present-day natural laws and processes exist not just here today, but through space and time. Darwin adopted this theory and argued further that it could be used to explain a continuous process of change in organisms. Hooker was a young man and shared a great love of naturalism with Darwin. The two became firm friends, and it was to Hooker that Darwin confined his theory of natural selection, which remained a secret between the two for a number of years. By the time that he had returned from his voyage, Darwin was convinced that organisms underwent a process of change and adaptation. He further theorized that this could be the case on a grand scale, and that the change which occurred within a species could be responsible for wholesale and dramatic changes, both in their appearance as well as their mode of life. In July 1837, Darwin commenced work on a new text which he called The Transformation of Species, and only just over a year later, he had recorded what he now called the theory of natural selection. Darwin documented the thought process that led to his theory in his notebooks. He began from an observation that sexual reproduction leads to greater variation in a species than does asexual or parthenogenic reproduction. Darwin noted that through reproduction, offspring within a species had differences from one another and from their parents, which can be referred to as random variation. These differences themselves did not appear to be directed toward any environmental advantage or design and were random, sometimes inhibiting the capacity of the organism to live, and other times enhancing it. A variation could, over a period of time, become ubiquitous amongst a population of offspring if it provided an advantage in life. Those within a species who were better suited to a certain environment would live and pass these characteristics on to their own offspring, leading an entire population within a certain area to bear these particular variations. Much of Darwin's theory was also based on establishing a common ancestor of species which had diverged from one another in present characteristics, which he did through an examination of fossils, demonstrating that species who shared relatively few characteristics with one another had in fact stemmed from the same ancestor, and that they had diverged from one another through adapting to particular environments. Darwin noted this point in his writing, stating that in South America, parent of all armadillos might be brother to Megatherium, now dead. The level of variation in nature had been well covered in previous works. The Archdeacon William Paley, often credited with articulating an argument for the existence of God from design through an analogy involving a watch, had himself written of the great differences present amongst animals and plants, which he had presented in his work Evidence for Christianity. Darwin was puzzled by the potency of seemingly designed adaptations among species which had evidently undergone random variation. This evidently frustrated him, and he wrote later that how selection could be applied to organisms living in a state of nature remained for some time a mystery to me. It was whilst reading Thomas Robert Malthus's work on population on the 3rd of October 1837 that Darwin finally cracked the mystery of selection, explaining the preservation of useful variation and the disappearance of unhelpful or inhibiting variation. Much of the remainder of Darwin's professional life was defined from this point. He was committed to demonstrating the potency of natural selection as an explanatory theory for the modern natural world, and worked hard to document it in nature. Darwin also had other matters on his mind in 1837. The latter part of the year saw him construct a document in which he debated the various pros and cons of getting married, in which he weighed a fear that he would be unable to travel and would have greater financial commitments to a constant companion, charms of music, and female chit-chat. He eventually erred on the side of marriage and entertained the joys which would come with it, before concluding, marry, 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 QED. Darwin evidently also had a constant companion in mind when he wrote his list, and proposed to Emma Wedgwood soon afterwards, and on the 11th of November 1838, the two were engaged to be married. Darwin and Emma departed on a week's holiday from London, after which they moved into a townhouse at 12 Upper Gower Street on New Year's Day 1839. Indeed, 1839 started well for Darwin, and he was appointed a member of the Royal Society on the 24th of January, 5 days before his wedding. The couple remained in London for a time, although increasingly poor health had motivated them to make a change. Darwin and Emma moved to a country home named Down House in the Kentish village of Down. Hooker and T.H. Huxley, a fellow biologist, were regular guests at Down House, and Darwin wrote lovingly of the rural isolation of the place and the solace which it afforded him to conduct experiments, read, and spend time with his family and close friends. On the 27th of December 1839, William, the first of 10 Darwin children, was born. William was of great interest to his father in many ways, including scientific, and he kept a detailed record of his son and his activities, including the ways in which he developed and adapted. Darwin was, by all accounts, a loving and devoted father who dedicated time in playing with and helping his children. He was very concerned with their health, but afforded them great freedom. Down House was a perfect environment in which Darwin could continue his research, and he stored vast amounts of information from his studies there, specimens and notes, as well as letters and documents that he had received from around the world, with information from experts and naturalists across the globe. Despite the joys of family, Down House, and his advancing scientific work, Darwin was plagued by illness from 1837 until the time that he died in 1882. When his father died, he was too ill to attend the funeral procession, and a dinner held after a scientific presentation could rob him of strength for a number of days. Darwin also suffered from a great deal of self-doubt, which he had surrounding the potency of his own theory of evolution, refusing to publish his findings until he had collected a wealth of evidence which he could use to overwhelm any potential critics. Originally intended to be a short essay, Darwin produced a draft for a 230-page-long work in which he outlined his theory and provided an incredible barrage of evidence for it. He had intended to keep the work to himself, although was encouraged by Hooker and Lyell, who were impressed and urged him to make his findings public. One of the major motives for Darwin's eventual decision to go public with his findings was the receipt of a letter from Alfred Russel Wallace, in which Wallace posited precisely the theory that Darwin had developed and asked him for a comment. Darwin did not wish to rob Wallace of what was a perfectly legitimate independent discovery, and arranged to have his findings published alongside Wallace's in a joint paper. It was this product that was presented before the Linnaean Society on the 1st of July 1858 and later published in the Society Journal. After this presentation, Darwin was motivated to more fully explain his own theory and findings, and did so in the form of the Origin of Species, which he managed to complete in the remarkably short period of 13 months. He would go on to write 10 further books, all of which laid out his position and provided evidence, and in doing so, he changed mankind's perception of the natural world in a profound manner. There are several reasons why Darwin waited such a long time to formally present his findings. He was greatly concerned with ensuring that he provided a mass of evidence to back up his claims, and was sidetracked somewhat by his work with barnacles, work which led him to investigate their reproductive processes and which showed him the significant variance in the phenotypes which developed. One of the major forces that influenced Darwin to produce and publish his Origin of Species was undoubtedly the influence of Wallace, and it is important that his work be remembered alongside that of Darwin as research which revolutionized biology. Once it had been produced and published, The Origin of Species was a hit. The first edition sold out on day one, and the subsequent editions which were drafted and produced were in great demand. The book itself was thoughtful and well organized, presenting the basis of the theory of evolution alongside a wealth of evidence which covered all major areas of known biology. Darwin also tracked the evolutionary development of several organisms and investigated how organs had become specialized to their roles, how some species had become extinct, and forecasted the explosion of the human population. One of the reasons for the success of the work was the review it received from the noted zoologist Thomas Henry Huxley, who praised the work and exclaimed, "How extremely stupid not to have thought of that." Several other highly influential scientists endorsed Darwin's work, including Hooker, Lyell, and Canon Tristram, the zoologist of the Bible. However, Darwin encountered much criticism as well as praise for his work, and was roundly attacked by writers such as Philip Goss, who asserted in his book Omphalos that the world had been created by God in the way that it now appeared. In other words, that nothing had changed since the world had been created. His book fell flat. Other critics attacked Darwin on a scientific basis. Adam Sedgwick argued that he had abandoned the accepted scientific method as it had been formed under Francis Bacon, and another dangerous opponent was presented in the form of Richard Owen, an anatomist and paleontologist who attacked The Origin of Species in a lengthy review, which Darwin himself stated was malignant and clever. Religious opposition to Darwin was furious, and he was accused by Henry Triman, the botanist, that the threat he had posed to the doctrine of the creation was so powerful that The Origin of Species had made Darwin the most dangerous man in England. Tensions on this matter came to a head during a notable debate at the British Association in Oxford, during which Bishop Wilberforce attacked the theory of evolution, which was successfully and effectively defended by Huxley, who was at the height of his power. Indeed, Huxley remained a staunch defender of Darwin, and at a later public encounter with Bishop Wilberforce was reported to have informed the bishop that he would rather have an ape for an ancestor than a man who used his reason and intellect to attack those seeking the truth. The incident apparently caused an audience member to faint, and Huxley's following scientific arguments, combined with this comment, led Wilberforce to silence. Darwin later jested to Huxley, "How durst you attack a live bishop in that fashion?" Similar battles were fought between scientists and preachers across the world. In the US, Germany, and Russia, exchanges were held publicly between scientists and their opponents, bringing academics such as Ernst Haeckel to the fore, in a position similar to that of Huxley. Darwin attracted political as well as scientific attention. Karl Marx repeatedly tried to dedicate his book Das Kapital to Darwin, although this was rejected on numerous occasions. Darwin was later honored with a statue in the Soviet Union, which was used in part to spearhead a rejection of religious ideology. After 1859, Darwin published 10 biological works, 6 of which were engaged with particular botanical problems, dealing with questions concerning devices for securing cross-pollination, as well as the operation of climbing plants. One concerned earthworms and their effect on the natural environment, and the other 3 concerned themselves with evolutionary biology. Many of these later works were designed to augment and complement the theory that he had presented in The Origin of Species, although they also contained some odd digressions into theories of sexual selection. The first of these was the variation of animals and plants under domestication. In this work, Darwin turned his attention to the significant variation which existed amongst domestic animals and included dogs, cats, and foals, examining and analyzing the variation which they exhibited. He maintained from this his original conclusion that evolution was a slow process which relied not upon sharp variance between members of a population, but on small, incremental differences which became increasingly potent in a species over a long period of time. Later in his life, Darwin presented the theory of pangenesis, which was his attempt to examine and explain the ways through which characteristics were transferred between members of a species. He posited that something called gemmules were transferred between beings through sexual reproduction, a theory which was, of course, erroneous, but which was nonetheless a valiant attempt to account for inheritance in the absence of any knowledge of DNA. Following his variations, Darwin worked on a new book, The Descent of Man, in which he sought to powerfully reject the idea that man had descended from Adam and Eve, and posited rather that they had developed over a great period of time through the process of natural selection. Darwin asserted that humans had descended from a form of ape-like primate, which may have originated in Africa, a theory which remains highly supported by more recent research conducted by academics such as Broom and Dart and Leakey. Many critics of the time were outraged at what they saw as his assertion that humans had monkeys as their ancestors, which was not, in fact, what he was arguing, since monkeys were the product of a period of evolutionary development which had been concurrent to that of humans. Darwin led his investigation with...
Okay, I think we'll go ahead and stop there for today. What I'd like to do is have you form about 3 different groups and spend some time talking about your takeaways. So groups of 3 or 4 would be ideal. I'll give you about 5 minutes. There's a lot to unpack in that video. Hopefully you have some points jotted down that you want to share with the class. So I will give you time to do that now. Thanks. Everyone awake?
They kept saying.
Yeah, I was trying to hold down a second. I look up at the board, they'd be on.
I thought it was interesting that he kept all of his findings a secret because he suffered with self-doubt so much.
So our most notable takeaway is that he was kind of very ahead of his time. He almost did genetics before indeed he was it was just kind of what was last said in it, but so that's a big thing. Is like you should know the reasons
Yeah, that went to
genetically before genotypes and phenotypes were founded.
The origin of species is like,
Yeah.
especially with Wallace, uploading of like.
Yeah. It's kind of see that a lot today too. Van lifers quit their jobs.
It's like Wallace is like,
That's what that reminded me of. It was like
a long time ago, but he just has to go. How long was he out on the Beagle?
5 years. Yeah.
While he was there, like judging like the tortoises and finches and different, probably even though the finches are really close together, like island-wise, there's still so much variation.
I also thought it was really interesting that he didn't get along with the captain. He was on him for 5 years.
I could get 10 kids.
Busy.
So I noticed one thing where he was like, Collins are married to hetero whole thing.
Yeah.
Okay, I guess we can.
He continued to do his work at, what was the house called, like the townhouse?
Yeah.
Yeah, he continued to like do his own studying while he was trying to like raise a family too.
So he was actually considered a good father. He took time and them as well and supported them. He didn't get much of the support from his own father, so.
When the father was only happy about it whenever he came back and actually like, it was like, oh, you're
I've done
success now.
something, yeah.
Give me an actual yes.
Did kind of prioritize him because didn't like school when it was supposed to go to, he would like leave early at nighttime to go visit his family.
So he had the house lady who was a psychologist, and then he was one who supported him and helped carry him. Whenever all of this stuff came out, everyone was like against him. What he's saying is not helped push his ideas.
Spend a couple more minutes discussing. I'd like to hear from each group for about 2 minutes. All right.
At the end is that like people tried not physically attacking him, but like, you know, attacking him and all of his theories, and people are still trying to do
Those religious oppositions.
Yeah.
Jack the Ripper, no, never. But Charles Darwin.
Yes, sir.
He was really kind of like religious opposition because he was basically doing like, this is real, it's all like, Adam and Eve weren't real.
Like
that was
every
just
time
like
points, like I said, Henslow and such, right?
now we're here.
But we actually remember.
It's good.
Yeah, I know how to do that. I was just trying to like,
Also, one of the things is that like
Yeah.
things can change.
I usually read the transcripts and then I have ADHD so bad, so
Have
like.
like variation throughout
I'll
time.
just be talking at the same time and then I'm like, yeah,
It's funny how.
I
much
really,
it's
there's no
like,
winning
yeah,
for me, like no matter how many
because
notes I
then, yeah,
take, I'm gonna have to rewatch it.
For him, it was like, I have to do this or something. He seemed very like ridiculous with his work.
But I did write down most of the places that he traveled
That he went to
because I thought
Brazil
that they were all really
for
interesting.
Yeah.
Where, you know,
Yeah,
Southern,
like the nature.
I wonder what would
nature
have
of his
happened.
grandest form.
It would have been somewhere else, you know what I mean?
That was funny when he saw the vampire bat.
Or like,
Like,
his relationship with the captain got any worse and he had left, we wouldn't even be talking about any of this.
Okay, 45 seconds. Not that I mean to shut down all discussion. Well, are we ready to go? Does that signify we're ready to go? All right, first group that wants to go may begin.
Alright.
All right.
A bunch of takeaways, but basically just kind of condensed into a really brief synopsis.
Synopsis. Okay, would you like to read the synopsis of your group?
We discussed the people and how he observed the local flora, fauna, and noticed differences according to geography, environments, and the elevation. He noticed nicks in biology, noticed differences, but also similarities, and guessed that they might have come from the same ancestors and adapted to their respective environment over time.
And
Okay. All right.
because he had been observing a lot of those different geologies, one of the things he noticed about the two surmises that might have come from a lava flow, that time changes things. And
Right.
because of that observation, was able to push that over to the, hey, time changes not only places, but plants and animals also.
Plants and animals. And then to the fact that time changes humans, right? So this idea, again, you can see how this is going to connect to psychology, right? Okay, good. Let's hear from you guys. I heard lots of good conversation, so please do not be timid and shy, this group.
I mean, one of the first things I said was that he's kind of ahead of his time on like genetics and stuff of, you know, how two different DNAs can switch without knowing that it was DNA.
Mm-hmm. Yes, Okay, good observation. Others?
We talked about Wallace and how even though Wallace came up with the paper, like had the idea, was gonna publish it first, that Darwin had a joint paper with him and they both came up with the idea of like natural selection and things like that.
But when you think of natural selection, do you think of Wallace? You think of Darwin? Yeah. But he played a major role in that. Yeah, good, thank you. What else, this group? Give me one more tidbit.
I mean, we kind of talked a lot about like the Down House, where he continued to study science while he was at home, and he still focused on his family. And then we kind of talked a lot about the aspects of, kind of has a unique take on family, because, you know, he would leave school to go home to his father, even though they weren't accepting of him at the time, because he was like a naturist. And then it's like now he's really focused on his family, because he still takes time away from science to take care of them, and had like 10 kids and stuff.
Yeah, and that's not something that we have seen a lot with these other philosophers. There's been very little mention of family other than family of origin, not, raising a family. Yeah, I wrote down something that I thought was kind of cute. He was interested in the charms of music and female chit-chat. So that was what a female companion would give them. So a debutante, I guess, could provide nice piano music that was unobtrusive, and I just thought that was sort of funny. Yeah, but he did value that. Good. Final group, some takeaways for us. If someone can speak.
Yeah, I thought it was interesting of how many like universities he went to and then quit and then went to another one.
Yes, yeah.
And then he was interested in traveling, so he went on a 5-year expedition all around the different places.
Yeah, so he didn't grow up in his mind that he wanted to do this, right? He finally latched onto something, but he drifted figuratively, and we can kind of say literally, like around for a while. That's important. One more thing from this group.
We also talked about how he didn't really have a good relationship with the captain, with Fitzroy, and he almost left. And if he left, we wouldn't even really be talking about this right now.
Yeah, so tumultuous relationship, but he stayed on because of his perseverance and belief in his ideas, right? And his ideas, he kept seeing, wow, there's more to this. This is playing out. It's playing out with geography. Now it's playing out with plants, and now we're seeing it in animals. So he held steadfast to that, and he persevered when he was ill, right? So, a strong legacy there. All right, I'm going to start by talking about this video in a little bit more detail and some items that I want you to grasp that maybe haven't been mentioned fully in class. Any questions before we leave for the day? No? Okay. Enjoy the flora and fauna. And happy National Polar Bear Day.